Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet many interesting people in various stages of their business. This season, we get to focus on the high-stakes implications of selling a business.
Mm-hmm.
This season's theme is the Hitchhiker's Guide to M&A. Now, Brad, we've been guest-heavy this season. We've been bringing in different professionals to offer their experiences and perspectives on M&A, but today, we're solo, Brad. It's just the two of us.
Oh, man. Bradley, you want to join us? Oh, well, I'm all right. We'll keep going for it. And Michael threw out these fancy legal term like M&A. For those who don't know, that means mergers and acquisitions. And again, another fancy legal jargon that when we say M&A or mergers and acquisitions, that means just simply the buying and selling of a business or the assets of the business.
Well done, Brad. Now, Brad, we've been spending a lot of time this year on leadership development.
Mm-hmm.
We've been working actually with one of our guests from this season, Robin Pugh.
Yeah, opening episode.
So I'm wondering, I have a question for you.
Okay.
When do you expect that this is going to start working for you?
Oh, nice zinger there early in the show, Michael.
I apologize, Brad. I meant to say no offense before I asked that question.
Oh, okay. Well, now it's all better now. Now that I know you did not mean to offend me. I guess but I'm not allowed to be offended, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a safe zone.
Safe. Okay.
After I say that.
All right.
Well, all seriousness, when we were doing the show prep, I started connecting today's story to this training we've been doing on leadership. And one of the principles that we're learning about is built around, kind of this training mantra, so to speak, that leaders are to inspire, teach, train, and coach those that they are leading.
Yeah. And there's a lot of defined terms I think you just kind of threw out there, but let's just kind of start with the very first one, inspired. And, for some people, I think you'll open up the dictionary and when you look at the word inspire, you'll see just a picture of me.
In your most humble, non-biased opinion, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. I mean, the second definition, which you probably see after you see the picture of me, is inspired generally means to stimulate others or to take an action or motivate others to follow. An example that resonated with me was a football analogy. Was that, after you play a football game, the next day you'll watch game tape. And while watching that game tape, you'll see a play that either, you did or one of your buddies did. And you were like, wow, how did they do that? How did you break on the ball like that? I want to figure out how to do that and play that well. So that's the inspiration that you get from watching others.
Yeah, and kind of as it was told to us in shorthand, what teach, train, and coach mean is, and this has really resonated with me, is teaching is you tell them, whatever it is you want to tell them. Training is that you show them how to do it. And the coaching is then supporting them as they do it on their own.
Yeah, and as necessary, you just keep repeating those actions in order.
And this started me thinking about our families, Brad. I started thinking about the things that my parents taught me as a kid that I've adopted as my own and are part of what I do and also have taught my kids.
I'm trying to figure out where we're going with this because I know your dad and your uncle and your boys and all of y'all have a sense of humor of a 13-year-old boy. So where are you going with that one?
Well, that's A, true, and B, probably the reason you get along so well with my family.
Yeah, in fact, that's correct.
The important thing for me that besides that, that came to mind for my dad is that my dad always instilled a strong sense of work ethic to me and to my siblings. This was not only taught to us and expectations, and it was more old school back then, grade oriented, results oriented, but he instilled that you got to work hard to get whatever you're trying to achieve. And he showed that to us because he was a young plastic surgeon during my childhood, and he was building his practice, and we were seeing, how hard he worked to achieve what he was trying to achieve professionally. And there are times all of us, in the Byrd family can be a little bit too type A in terms of our work. But the powerful lesson that I've learned that we really try to instill in our kids is that we can control how hard we work. We can do our best and then just let go, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. And I know your dad, and that actually reflects pretty well of him because he does have a sense of humor, but I've seen it when, and a great work ethic on top of that. But tell me about your mom.
Well, my mom instilled kindness in all of us. My mom
Did she skip you first?
Hey, I'm going to be nice to you, Brad, because it'll disprove my point. My mom was nice to everyone she interacted with, and still is.
Yes,
and
she's lovely.
And she expected kindness out of all of us as kids. And I could just see the impact just watching her that had, and how she really didn't have enemies, and even the people that she probably secretly didn't care for, she had a decent relationship because she chose to be kind. And now as a parent, I realize how hard this is to teach your kids, especially when they're in their teenage years, or as my daughter, who's coming out of her teenage years or just started her teenage years, says, the dark ages. How about you, Brad? Do you have an example of something your parents instilled in you that you've kind of adopted and now trying to instill in your kids?
Yeah, I have. We could probably spend an entire episode on the things that have been instilled in our parents, because I love your parents too. So they're great people. I know I thought of two things that really jumped out at me that I try to work with my kids on. One is do it right the first time. My dad must have said that to me 1,000 times. Taking the garbage out, putting it all back together as it was beforehand, whatever it was, no matter what you did, do it right the first time, and then you don't have to repeat. Almost like the 550 rule. And then, and then be on time and be present when you're there. And so those are things that I talk to our kids about, is why it's so important to be that way. And it's funny because my mom instilled in me in the sense of, well, my mom's a ferocious reader, which I got a lot of that from her too, but she does not believe in being on time. And so it's been an interesting life, because we've learned how if we show up at 12:30 for an event, the event actually starts at 1. But my dad does not tell anyone, because we will actually get there at 12:59 because my mom always runs late. So, but I've tried to instill my kids, do it right the first time and be on time. Those are some of the first starter kits you can get somebody to get going.
I wonder why why your mom and I get along so well. Our sense of timeliness,
and why I like you. I have something familiar about you. All right, Michael, that was fun. But before we get into today's story, I know we have someone across from me who likes context. And we talked about the seasons of businesses and the 5 phases of the M&A deal. So let's kind of give a quick recap for those listening for the very first time.
Yeah, and I like that we keep starting with the context, probably because I love context, but also because we can't, I don't think, overstate, when you're talking about selling a business, how much impact the other seasons of your business have on that phase.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we talk about, there's every business is in 1 of 4 seasons. They're in the building season. They may be trying to create or fix their structure or infrastructure. They're in the operating season or the scaling season. They're growing, or they're buying and selling season, which, is where we're camping out this season. With the Hitchhiker's Guide to M&A.
Yeah.
And then we talk about this timeline in an M&A deal that is the 5 phases. And
right.
We have the letter of intent, then the due diligence, the definitive agreements, then we have a closing, and then there's stuff that happens after closing. We call the post-closing obligations. And we've touched on all of these different phases throughout this season. For today's show, we're going to spotlight a specific exit strategy on selling a business. And so we will end up kind of touching on all the phases.
Fun. Awesome. Well, let's jump into the story.
Today, Brad, our story focuses on a solo practice physician who hired us to help with his exit plan.
Okay.
The strategy adopted was what we here internally at ByrdAdatto call the Sensei Plan.
All right. Well, I feel like we have a lot of vocabulary words being thrown out today, but audience members, the Sensei Plan is really a term, as Michael says, it's a strategy that we use when a business, or in this case, the practice owner, wants to hire a younger physician, and then train that physician from both, how to do it from a business perspective and a clinical perspective, and then eventually have the ability to sell that practice to the physician. So that's the term of art we kind of use here at ByrdAdatto. And the concept here is that the owner is going to train this young physician on how to be a great doctor, and the future leader of the practice, hence the Sensei Plan.
Okay. Well, from a 5 phases perspective, this Sensei Plan is a long play.
Yes.
You have to find the doctor. You have to then employ the doctor. You have to then train the doctor. And this is typically a minimum of 2 years from the date they are hired, and sometimes longer before you even get to this M&A deal. And there's even more to it than that. So as we get into today's story, Brad, our client, the senior doctor in today's story, is Dr. Clooney.
Okay, I'm gonna have to call you out on this one. I feel like you get kind of lazy. First off, I'm assuming you're referencing the TV show ER, and I don't think his name was Dr. Clooney in that show.
No, Brad, you're gonna be really happy because I know you know the reason and the story behind this reason. You and I both, a couple of years ago, I think this was on Smart List.
So wait, is this okay? Go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we heard a story that George Clooney told about a practical joke he pulled on his roommate many, many years ago.
That's so genius.
It was a long play painting practical jokes. So I didn't go look it up before it shows. I'm going off memory. If you start to remember, you can plug in any details. But essentially what I remember about the story was that George Clooney had a roommate that he was at, some like garage sale type situation and saw like the ugliest painting he'd ever seen. He bought it and stored it in his closet. And then his roommate noticed that he decided to take up an interest in painting. And he said that he was taking all these lessons and he was so excited about, learning this craft. He went out, I think if I recall right, went out and bought all these fancy art supplies and had them at their apartment. And whenever his roommate come home, he would scramble and be set up like he was, long at work at painting, but not let his roommate see what he was up to. This went on for, I think, over a year, if I remember the story right. Yeah. And so the practical joke was that at one point it was his roommate's birthday and he made this big deal of wrapping up this ugly painting in a bow and making it a big surprise. He built the whole thing up and gave this ugly painting to his roommate, who was mortified that it was so ugly, yet knew from watching over a year of all this passion or apparent passion from him. And so that ugly painting got hung up in the middle of their living room.
Yes, that is a super awesome long play joke. And by the way, Michael, I don't know if you know that, but I'm recently taking up painting.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll be on the lookout when it's my birthday.
Yes.
For something amazing.
Okay. Back to the story.
Yeah. And so you have to that's a good name, right?
Yeah.
Approved.
Right. Yeah.
Dr. Clooney. Dr. Clooney had found a young physician that he wanted to hire out of fellowship training. So a little about Dr. Clooney. He was a reputable surgeon with a thriving practice. His practice had a great culture. Dr. Clooney was known for being kind and reasonable. Maybe he knew my mom. I don't know.
Yeah.
His obstacles were that he was self-taught on running a business. And that had worked great for him for 25 years when it was just him as the only owner and the only decision maker in the business. But implementing the Sensei Plan was asking him to start using a skill set that he did not have.
Okay. I hope this obstacle is not a foreshadowing of a story going bad. I'm assuming, but did you talk to him about the Sensei Plan at the time?
Well, Brad, I actually picked this story today because it does have a happy ending.
Okay, good.
It was definitely not smooth sailing.
Okay.
But we did talk about the Sensei Plan when we were going through his options, and he really liked that strategy.
Awesome. Well, tell the audience what happens first when implementing the Sensei Plan.
Well, the first step is to find a doctor, which is always a trick.
Yes, it is.
The clients inevitably ask, if I have a Rolodex of doctors to hire. So,
yes. You don't?
Fact check. True. I do not.
Okay.
But he did find a young physician.
Cool.
And the step was to hire him and employ him as an employee. And we'll call him Dr. Kool-Aid.
Okay. Well, now I'm afraid to ask why Dr. Kool-Aid, but is this young fit physician going to come crashing through a wall like the old Kool-Aid commercial?
Well, Brad, I have to say that it is the least shocking news that you're referencing a commercial from the 80s that probably everybody doesn't know.
Riley, any idea? She's shaking her head. Yes, I think
Oh,
positively. It
okay.
looked like yes to me.
Sure, sure, Brad. We'll move on. So, we discovered from the beginning during this recruitment and employment process that this physician that we're calling Dr. Kool-Aid, he believed that Dr. Clooney was the best person for him to join. He believed that this practice was an amazing practice, and ultimately he really was committed early on to being there with Dr. Clooney and for this being his future practice. And he believed that Dr. Clooney was a good person and that they could work through any hard conversations. In other words, Brad, he drank the Kool-Aid.
Well, okay, the name makes sense, and it can be a benefit. How did the employment phase go?
This actually was pretty smooth. The employment agreement was going to be there for 3 years.
Okay.
Everyone was clear that the buy-in would be around that time, and that the first 3 years would be all about getting Dr. Kool-Aid busy and to learn the ways of Dr. Clooney, thus the Sensei Plan.
Yes.
This entire period went great and was actually the foundation that allowed the next phase to be successful.
Yeah, that's probably the time, and it depends, audience member. Sometimes that happens within the first year and a half. Sometimes it happens in year 2. But at some point during this employment phase, they're going to start working out the details of what does ownership look like. And then maybe in the second half, we can kind of dive deeper into when to have those conversations. But it's not uncommon as you're closing out that whatever the initial term of that agreement you said was 3 years to start having these conversations. So did Dr. Clooney and Dr. Kool-Aid discuss any details of ownership back when they actually even signed the employment agreement?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Riley, please delete that statement. Recognizing Brad's great question. They did not yet. It's a fair question to ask, because we ask our when we're representing the young physicians to ask, are they having these conversations?
Sure.
And what are the expectations? And so they didn't. The risk when you do not deal with it at all is that you have no idea how things will go later.
Mm-hmm.
And the risk is it could be a wasted 2, or in this case, 3 years if things fall apart. So the only thing they discussed back when they did the employment agreement was the timeline, the 3-year timeline.
Okay, this makes me nervous. Riley, hold the button, but it might be kind of we might have some scary music coming up. But what happened when they started the buy-in phase?
Well, the good news is they were committed, both of them, to making it work.
That is good news.
The hard part, as we just noted, is they hadn't discussed anything. Yeah. And you know, Dr. Clooney had his own preconceived notions because he'd run his own business, but this wasn't his skill set. But he wanted to make the arrangement work with Dr. Kool-Aid, and he wanted them to be side by side as they figured out what this would look like. So that was a little bit atypical.
Yeah. Well, our longtime clients, probably our audience members, will know that we're probably going to say a word right here, which is something we love, which is the whiteboard meeting. This is a situation where we can outline what do you currently look like, what is your structure like, where do you want to go, and let's start drawing out this future plan so we can see it. And for us, we actually visually draw these things out and pull information out of individuals to really to get this conversation being spurred on, and which helps us later on get more details that we need to actually further dive into during these whiteboard sessions. So I'm going to ask, I'm assuming the answer hopefully is yes. Did you have a whiteboard meeting?
You can say that, Brad. We had 6 whiteboard meetings over the course of a year.
Ooh, okay, wait. I know you're making fun of my whole leadership training thing, but that sounds like more than a whiteboard.
Yes, Brad. Yes, you're correct. So as I mentioned, Dr. Clooney wanted them to kind of figure out the deal, together. And so we would show up, the 2 of them would come on a whiteboard with me, and we would try to figure out whatever the discussion point would be. And they may get stuck on something, and we would end up reconvening every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, this wasn't the original plan. We were trying to do it just kind of our normal process, but they were doing it together without any pre-thought. B, as I said, Dr. Clooney had some of his own kind of preconceived notions. So, they were figuring it out together each step of the way. And Dr. Clooney's preconceived notions kind of complicated it. They would veer off course a little bit, and then we'd have to, kind of pull it back together. And so we had multiple reset conversations between the whiteboards.
Yeah, and audience members, have these hard conversations after the young physician has been integrated into the fabric of the practice. These types of elements can actually make it more difficult because they feel like they're kind of already part of the practice. And it sounds like because you had so many whiteboards, is you had to keep resetting these expectations to find where is the alignment of the parties.
Yeah, for sure. And it in many other circumstances probably, would have been a high risk of falling apart. But let's find out what happens. Let's go to break and then come back and talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from Dr. Clooney's story and find out what happened.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, there are various different strategies that a physician can employ as part of their exit strategy.
Yeah, so the exit plan that our story today focused on was the Sensei Plan. And so our client was a senior physician, Dr. Clooney, and he was looking at, how is he going to sell his practice? Mm-hmm. And so he decided to implement the Sensei Plan, which means he was going to recruit a young physician. Yeah, that young physician was going to come be an employee and be trained in all the ways like a good grasshopper, mm-hmm. and then ultimately buy the practice. And so today's story has worked out pretty well in how that plan executed. Dr. Clooney found a doctor, found someone they have a really good relationship with each other, had a really smooth employment phase. And so there was a lot of mutual respect through the training and working together and collaboration that happened during that season, which really set them up for a more challenging next step, which was trying to figure out what ownership was going to look like.
Yeah.
And kind of where we left off was me sharing the 1 year journey of 6 whiteboards to even figure out what their purchase arrangement would look like. And by the way, that's way longer time period than normal. Usually it's maybe a 90-day time period to go from, I'm done being an employee, I'm ready to be a partner.
Yeah. And, I think, we're talking about the Sensei Plan audience members, but we have a couple different other plans, exit plans that we talk to our clients about. So I'll just give you some context of what's else out there, because you're like, I don't know if I want to do the Sensei Plan. Well, what other plans are there? So we have ones we call like the Fixer Upper Plan. Now, this is a plan in which, for whatever reason, if you're trying to bring in someone or get your house in order, there may be some compliance things that we have to clean up, or it may be a structural aspect because of the way you're structured. So that's the Fixer Upper Plan. Then we have like the old school plan, which is what most physicians do, which is kind of they kind of run the clock out a little bit, but they don't really think much about what they're going to do with their organization, and maybe they might try to sell it near the end. And those don't tend to typically have very good sale prices, because you're ready to leave and then you're selling at the last minute. So those prices can be at the lower end. And then you have the mic drop plan. The mic drop plan is you've done such a good job that you've situated yourself that you don't have to find someone else to buy your practice, because financially you're secure and you just want to drop the mic and walk out the door. And when that happens, there's certain filings and other things you have to take care of from a state perspective and making sure your patients are taken care of. And then a phase that seems to be something something we didn't really talk that much about until the last couple of years, which is the Gordon Gekko plan, which is the plan in which you want to turn around and sell yourself to private equity. So those are kind of besides the Sensei Plan, other plans that we see often in this. And let's tie this back together to where we were talking about with the Sensei Plan, Michael. You had talked about the 5 phases of M&A deal, in which we talked about LOIs and due diligence, definitive agreements, and closing and post-closing. But it seems to all kind of come together here with the Sensei Plan.
Yeah, it's weird because the Sensei Plan is the long play,
right?
And so the 5 phases work a little bit differently. And
Sure.
so I'm going to skip the LOI for a minute because what we do know happens a lot significantly during this employment period is the due diligence phase.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting to know each other. And so yes, there's probably some financial information and traditional stuff that you would want to see and need to see if you're buying a practice. But a lot of the confirming that, this business is a place you want to be, you get to actually experience as an employee of that practice for that 3-year period, and you get to see it happening.
And that's a great point, because a lot of people, when we talk about M&A deals, they think of due diligence, turning over documents. This is a situation where relationship wise, do you get along? Because they may be in the Sensei Plan, they may be your partner for 3 to 5 to 6 more years after the fact. And if the person is which we've seen before, unfortunately, is a phenomenal surgeon but a terrible leader, are you going to really want to partner with this person? Do you really want them to be eventually managing your staff? And so that due diligence phase is really that relationship phase, besides understand the documentation that we see in M&A deals.
100%. I mean, you get to actually work with the employees that you'll be inheriting if you buy this practice, and know how you feel about that.
Sure.
But what's interesting is I put a pin in the LOI phase for a moment, is in the Sensei Plan, that sometimes happens actually in the employment agreement. There are times where they say, okay, here's the bullet points at a high level of what ownership is going to look like whenever 2 to 3 years down the line.
Yeah.
And so you have that LOI phase happening at the beginning. And then sometimes it happens, where it is here, they didn't have an LOI at all. They did their due diligence and then, did 6 whiteboards basically to figure out their LOI.
And I think that's a really good point, is a lot of times if you need to go towards a Sensei Plan and bring that young physician in, sometimes having those harder conversations up front as to what does that ownership look like? How much are you willing to sell? How are you going to get the purchase price? And these are hard because sometimes you don't know the answer, but it's important to have those discussions up front.
And the closing is really interesting in the Sensei Plan because it tends to be staged in a sense. So typically the young doctor is buying a portion of the practice at this point.
That's right.
And so it may be up to 50% at this first closing. And they probably have an agreement that contemplates the young doctor buying the rest when the senior physician is ready to retire. And then, the post-closing is a little bit different because of this partnership element. They're going to be working together now as co-owners, which is different. They are now both have seats at the table and are sharing profits, sharing decisions, et cetera. And so there's an impact to be considered.
Yeah. And in our past conversations, we talk about alignment of ownership, but this is really where we bring in the 4 C's into other conversations. And so it has to come into the Sensei Plan, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we don't have time to dive into, we've touched it in many prior episodes, but the 4 C's are cost, compensation, control, and contingencies. And these are these areas that we've deemed by experience are things that make or break a partnership. And so you absolutely got to incorporate that into the conversation when you're executing on the Sensei Plan.
Perfect. Well, Michael, what happened with Dr. Clooney and Dr. Kool-Aid?
Brad, they finally closed and have been partners for a while now. This is a happy story that made it onto one of our podcast episodes. It's amazing.
Yes.
And everyone's thrilled with the outcome, and they're even happy with their lawyers.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just say this, and this is the part where we have these conversations all the time, especially with the Sensei Plan. It's a hard decision when to start figuring out how much information you're going to give out as far as financials or what your practice is worth. But it's important, no matter where you are in the Sensei Plan, to start thinking about those and making sure that you're well aware of what you want to do, and more importantly, what you're willing to sell and how much control you're willing to give up. But Michael, what are some of your final thoughts?
Yeah, this actually was a lesson that was taught to me because the way this story played out with the 6 whiteboards. And I have so many other stories that failed whenever there was this non-alignment at that stage. It really taught me that if you're going to do the long play and go with the Sensei Plan, the relationship is king.
Yeah.
And you if you have two people that are committed to each other, you can work out the details, and it's more likely to work out if that commitment and trust remains. And so, I think that they could take a little dose if you want to do the Sensei Plan from my mom, which is if you can be kind to each other through the process, you may be able to get it figured out.
Awesome. Well, great story, Michael. And audience members, believe it or not, that's all the time we have today. Next Wednesday, we will continue our journey in the Hitchhiker's Guide to M&A. We will turn our spotlight on the aesthetic industry, and we'll have our special guest in studio, Alex Tiersch.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.